Hello everyone, Robert Lowell Goller here. Thanks for joining me for our weekly chat about local history. Again, I appreciate the support of this project and the comments that you keep sending in. It's wonderful, and it's wonderful to be able to chat about local history in a pretty informal way. I spend a lot of time researching and doing all the footnotes and writing the history, and sometimes it's nice to just be able to chat about it. This week's topic I've been thinking about for the past couple weeks, actually since the inauguration, President Trump's inauguration, and there's been a lot in the news about his decision through an executive order to change the name of Denali in Alaska to back to Mount McKinley, and then of course the Gulf of Mexico he has changed to the Gulf of America. And there's been a lot of discussion about it, and actually some comedians have, it's fodder for comedians, because can the president do this, and why would you change the name of a water, the Gulf of Mexico, or anything like that, and who gets to decide, and whether or not President Trump does have the ability to decide this. And that got me thinking about something that has been on my mind probably since I became a historian, is how the evolution of how things got named, how our streets get named, how our towns get named, and who gets to decide. And over time, you'll see names change of places, and I've always been intrigued about the timeline of these things and who gets to decide. Who decides what the town is named, or what a street is named, or what a waterway is named. One of the sort of a subset of that topic is the spelling of various places. And there are two things that popped out to me while you look at old maps, and someone had asked me about it, is sometimes you'll see a different spelling for a village or a town or a hamlet in the 1800s than you'll see today. Sometimes the streets and the towns change the names completely, but even more interesting, and usually a town or a community was named after someone who lived there. For instance, Griffin's Mills used to be known as Smith's Corners because Mr. Smith lived there, and then when Mr. Smith left and the Griffins came in, they named it Griffin's Mills. So that explains that. But how come, for instance, there are two that pop out to me on local maps? Sometimes you look at old maps, the 1800s, and you'll see Griffin's Mills. Speaking of Griffin's Mills, it's a hamlet in the town of Aurora. Today it's spelled Griffins without an apostrophe, Griffins Mills. But in fact, it's named after the Griffin family, particularly James Griffin, not the old former mayor of Buffalo. It was a different James, Jimmy Griffin, an early settler of Griffin's, what is today Griffin's Mills. And he had a mill, and so it became known as Griffin's Mills. Well, it was possessive. It was Mr. Griffin's mill. And so the community became known as Griffin apostrophe S Mills. And even still, if it was for the family, it would be Griffin's S apostrophe Mills, if you wanted to be grammatically correct. So today, you'll see there's no apostrophe. It's just Griffin's Mills without, and it's not Griffin Mills, one Griffin for the actual name of the family. It's Griffins. Well, and then the second one I've noticed was Hamburg. Old maps, 1800s, you'll see Hamburg with an H. Berg, and you'll see a lot of communities that have Berg at the end of it. And by the way, Berg is a German term for fortress, a community that is well protected. And so a lot of communities would have Berg at the end of them, and they have the H on the end. So Hamburg, and then Orchard Park used to be East Hamburg, and they had the H at the end on some really old maps. And today Hamburg is spelled Hamburg without the H. Well, this all goes back to partly a decision in 1891 by the federal government to actually regulate how we name places, and to make sure that there was a standard for how we name places, because places were having different spellings for the same sounds. So Berg, for instance, some communities with Berg at the end would be Berg, some were B-U-R-G-H, and some were just B-U-R-G. And so they came up with a system in 1891, and they had a variety of points that they were trying to institute. I think it was 13 of them, about a dozen different things to standardize how we name places. And one of them was to get rid of apostrophes. So Griffin's Mills with apostrophe S became Griffins without the apostrophe. Now, that was 1891 that they came out with these rules. So places across the country were getting rid of the apostrophes. And a lot of this had to do with the post office as well. The post office wanted standardized, easier ways to address envelopes and things, or have the communities, and the apostrophe got in the way in many cases. So they got rid of the apostrophes. They also got rid of the H at the end of Burg. So and they were supposed to spell it B-U-R-G. Everybody who had a burg at the end of the name of their community was to take the H off the end and not spell it B-E-R-G, but B-U-R-G. Now, there are some exceptions, you'll note, and they actually carved out exceptions to these rules. And one of the more probably notable exceptions to the apostrophe rule is Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. And then Pittsburgh actually has the H at the end of it. And they carved out an exception to that. Now, what happened there is, and this is to my second point about this, is the 1891 rule was not exactly when all these names changed. Actually, what one of the guidelines that that they used in these when they developed these rules was to closely match what people were already using. So the G's were dropped from a lot of places with Berg well before 1891. And the apostrophes for a lot of places were dropped well before 1891. And as a matter of fact, that's what happened in Hamburg and East Hamburg and Griffin's Mills. On old maps, so 1829, 1839 maps that we have, Hamburg is spelled with an H, and East Hamburg are spelled with an H. Griffin's Mills has an apostrophe, Griffin apostrophe S Mills. 1855 and 1880 maps, Hamburg spelled without the H, and Griffin's Mills is spelled without the apostrophe. So those two maps, 1855 and 1880, came before the federal government got involved and put out these guidelines and these rules. So these things were happening before the federal government got involved, and the federal government tended to just be following the lead of what many communities were already doing, taking the H off the end of Berg. Pittsburgh actually had a problem because they had various spellings of Pittsburgh just internally. The early city charters had no H at the end of it, but other places had the H. And then after the federal government came out with its regulations in 1891, Pittsburgh, a lot of the government still used the H, so that's how they, so many people were using the H at the end of Pittsburgh that they just allowed them to keep using it. And so Pittsburgh is with the H is now the accepted spelling, both by the federal government and the local authorities. So a lot of these things were happening before 1891. And the H issue on Pittsburgh, I think a lot of it might have just been the difference between spellings between immigrants from Germany, and the H was sort of silent anyway, and so they just kind of, depending on who was making the maps, would take the H off the end. Another interesting change that they made in 1891 was the spelling of center. On old maps, you'll see Center Street, C-E-N-T-R-E. And Wales Center is spelled on old maps as C-E-N-T-R-E. And same thing, as you got after the Civil War and other maps being made, they changed the spelling to E-R. I have seen Center Street spelled R-E as late as the 1920s. But One of the rules that the federal government came out with in 1891 was to standardize the spelling of center, because they had the perhaps English spelling of center with R-E, and so they changed it to S-C-E-N-T-E-R. So that would have been a universal change in 1891, but a lot of communities, including ours, were getting rid of the R-E spelling even before that. Hyphens were another thing they got rid of. So you'll have like Angola on the Lake. Officially does not have the spelling with hyphens on it, even though sometimes you'll see people say that. There are exceptions again, and they outline these specific exceptions. Croton-on-Hudson, the community along the Hudson River near New York City, they have hyphens in their name. But in most cases, they got rid of the hyphens, and so they were standardizing the names across the board. Now, where does this all come from? Why is the federal government in charge, and who gets to decide how to name a place? And who, if there are two different names for places, that's happened over time. And so you have to settle on one name. And so there is actually a federal agency, a federal board, as a matter of fact. It's the U.S. Domestic Names Committee, and there is a U.S. Board on Geographic Names, and they run this website and this system called the Geographic Names Information System. And I'll put a link to the website that you can go on and learn more things. You can actually look up communities' names to get the exact spelling and the exact form of the name that you're looking for. But they actually come out with decisions. They approve new names. You can apply to name a community, and there's a system in place where you have to go through local government and state government and name it. And so they have a board that makes decisions on geographic names. So this is the connection between the history on Griffin's Mills and Hamburg and today, and the renaming of President Trump wants to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, and this committee or board on geographic name is actually under the Interior Department, and the Interior Department after President Trump issued his executive order changing the name of to Mount McKinley in Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico, it goes to this board on geographic names. And the Interior Department, whether they had gone through the board ahead of time or whether they were following procedure is another issue. There's a lot going on in the current administration that may be suspect of following traditional procedure. But it would go through this board on geographic names, which is part of the Interior Department. They put out a press release saying that they would be following the executive order as if it were law, so that any other procedure would not be necessary, that the president issuing the executive order to rename the Gulf of Mexico would be approved, and that this board on geographic names making that change would make the change, would solidify that, would make it legal, would change it as far as the United States government was concerned. So the change of the name will be finalized once it goes through this board on geographic names. So the Gulf of Mexico, the change to Gulf of America is the same process that would have happened by changing the name of Hamburg or Griffin's Mills officially, and coming up with an official name. So to answer the question of who gets to decide how something is named, ultimately any geographic place, ultimately it's the decision of this board on geographic names, which is part of the federal government. And so when they changed Mount McKinley back to its Aboriginal name, they went through the board on geographic names, and now that President Trump has changed it back to Mount McKinley, it will go through the board on geographic names just as it did the first time around. And so all these, it's interesting how there's the link between the change of Gulf of Mexico and our local towns and how that works out. And so it's the same process. So connecting local history to national history, it's the same process. Now, another thing that the Board on Geographic Names does as well is change derogatory names, and that's been happening quite a bit. So old names that would have been seen as appropriate even 50 years ago are now being changed. One of them is there's a lot of islands and places even nearby. There was one in Canandaigua when I lived there. We always called it's a derogatory name toward Native American women. And it was that name island. And there's one nearby here too in Western New York. And they a few years ago came out with a statement declaring that those names are no longer acceptable, and that a new name had to be put in place for any geographic place that had that name. So in addition to picking and finalizing the names of geographic places, they actually have the authority to force the official name change. So in effect, anyone who still calls the Gulf of Mexico in the United States will be overridden by this national Board of Geographic Names. Now, that does not mean that local places won't continue to call something by its original name. I have a suspicion that no matter how much they say that the Gulf of Mexico is a Gulf of America, that people are going to still call it the Gulf of Mexico. But the official name will be Gulf of America. And the same with here. Over time, even though after a name became official, in Griffin's Mills in Hamburg, perhaps there were people still, putting the apostrophe on Griffin's Mills and, putting the H at the end of Hamburg. But the official name would have been determined by this National Board on Geographic Names, as well as their 1891 guidelines that came out in order to make sure that everybody was on the same page. So this is why you see in old maps sometimes different spellings. They seem like archaic spellings. And often these names changed even before the federal government stepped in and standardized how we do the names. And that goes for Hamburg and East Hamburg. I read somewhere that in a historical account that Hamburg dropped the H sometime around World War I is when they said. Well, even I can't find any place. We found places where they had the H on there as an archaic, nostalgic way to put it, but it would have been way before World War I. In fact, the maps, it would have definitely been by 1891, which would have been, several decades earlier, but all the maps even earlier than that, 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s, showed Hamburg without the H. So a lot of these things happened even earlier. And that was just over time, as depending on who was making the maps and how the towns, a clerk, a town board, the H often got dropped because it was silent, and it was seen as superfluous in many cases. And in some cases, I might say some changes of names were out of anti-immigrant mentalities. You'll see that a lot where the timing of the name changes, where they're dropping certain letters to make more Americanize the spelling. It's just too coincidental that the name changes are happening during times where there are anti-immigrant sentiments happening. So that's probably part of it as well. German spellings of certain places. So that happened. There's no doubt that happened as well. So again, I'll put the link to the page. It's really interesting, the place name page. You could delve into it. There's a place to search names, spellings of names, and you'll get to see how many communities have the same name. That's another thing they decide. The post office does this too. They don't allow the same spelling of two places in the same state or nearby. And this Board of Geographic Names also considers that as well, to make sure that there's not the same name in close proximity to each other, because it would cause confusion. So interesting. And so that is why the names of these communities are spelled the way they are today, and why they may have been spelled differently in the 1800s. So thank you again for joining me. Again, I'm Robert Lowell Goller. I am the Town and Village Historian here in the town of Aurora, but my videos and a lot of my research are not officially connected to my duties as Town and Village Historian. If you have any ideas like this one, I'm backlogged on ideas a little bit. I have them ready for the next couple weeks. There's some really great ones. We're going to talk about histories of trees and the impact of open meetings laws and open government records laws on the study of history. That is really important, so we'll talk about that. And I got a few other ideas as well that were brought to me by you. So if you do have ideas, feel free to pop them in the comments or send me a message. And as always, thank you for keeping history alive, and we'll see you next time. Until then, take care.